taking some time out of your day to be with us. We're here today, as promised, with Senior Software Engineer Max Hawkins on the Developer Experience team and Senior Director of Product Marketing, Dan Giordano. And I'm Kirsten Lambertson. I am Senior Product Manager of Developer Experience as well. So Max and I work very closely together. Today we're going to be talking about how we've been doing some work on our own product to optimize the experience for our marketing team when it comes to creating marketing pages, landing pages using Contentful. As a as a product manager, I hear about this a lot from our users, that this is something that they do regularly. And so we've thought it would be useful to share out how we've approached the task and things that we've solved for, challenges we've run into, all of that. So without further ado, let's talk for just a couple seconds and get to know Max and Dan. I'm going to start with Max. How long have you been at Gatsby?
Hey, Kirsten. So I started at Gatsby just about a year ago, last July.
Happy almost 1-year anniversary. That's cool.
Thank you.
And what are your hobbies and or interests outside of work?
Oh, man. Well, it's definitely changed in the past year, but before that, one of the things I love to do is social dance. So my wife and I would go out and do particularly Latin dance. We dance a specific type of dance called bachata. So we do that a lot. And outside of that, kind of the typical things, video games, reading, long walks, and weightlifting.
And weightlifting. So I did not know about the dancing, and we will be talking about that later. Because that's super interesting. Last question, the hardest question for last. What's your number one all-time favorite movie or TV series?
That's tough. I think I have two answers on this movie question. So I think for most of my life, the answer would be The Matrix. I think it's a perfect movie, top to bottom. I think it blew my mind when I saw it in '99. But I think these days, the way I think about the best movie, my favorite movie is the one that anytime you can watch it, anytime it's on TV, doesn't matter where it is, you're just gonna watch that movie till the end. And for me, that's Scott Pilgrim versus the World. I love that movie. It's super funny.
I've never seen this movie. Okay,
so
that's
good.
One on my list.
So good. Written and directed by Right. If you've seen Shaun of the Dead or Hot Fuzz, it's an amazing movie, amazing soundtrack. Love it.
All right, that one on my list. All right, next, Dan. Next victim is Dan. Dan, how long have you been with Gatsby?
I have been here about 6 months now. So a little bit newer than Max, but gaining my experienced legs here, I would say.
And really making a lot of impact in those 6 months. We can all agree. What was the next question? Of course. What are your hobbies and or interests outside of work, or one that you want to
share? Outside of work has been home improvement lately. So I just moved into my first house. So
congrats.
Small things around. Thank you. But it's been a little bit more than renting previously was. So I'd say that is my hobby. Home improvement.
Fixing up your house. I hear you.
Yes.
I hear you. When we moved into our house, we were house poor. You know that term? Which means we had a house, and 2 children and a dog, but no furniture.
I was going to say, you have to furnish the house. That is the part they kind of don't tell you about.
You kind of forget about that part until you're in it and have nowhere to sit, especially with the baby. What's your numero uno, all-time favorite movie or TV series?
I am going to go with a movie, and I'd go with Godfather Part 2.
Nice one.
Because I'm obsessed with those first 2 movies. I also just watched Chinatown for the first time, and I thought that was actually just as highly billed as it should have been. It's one of those things where everyone talks about classics. You don't know if it's actually going to hold up, and then you see it and you're like, yeah, of course, that's why everyone thinks it's great. So that was a pretty awesome experience lately.
Good for you, because that's because I endeavor to do some writing in my spare time, and that movie is always referenced by every writing,
Perfect
especially
script.
screenwriting teacher. Yeah, it just embodies all of the qualities of great storytelling, that movie. So
It does.
yeah. All right. So that makes us all feel more warmed up, and we do like everybody to get to know, especially Dan, you're newer, so it's great for the community to get to know you a little bit before we dive into the gory details. So I'm going to hand it over to you guys now and mute myself, and I'll be watching the chat, everybody, and bringing up questions as they come up for Dan and Max to answer, but take it away, guys.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kirsten. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about self-service landing pages. And to get started with that, we wanted to talk a little bit about the background and the motivations for this project. And the background is really that our marketing team does a ton of work to make sure that people know about everything that we do here at Gatsby. And one of the things that they do is they build landing pages on gatsbyjs.com. And so if you go to gatsbyjs.com / cloud or / concierge, those are landing pages. And basically what they do is they talk about products that we've built, campaigns, events like webinars and conferences, those types of things. So how do they create those pages? Well, historically, two ways. Either they had to work with engineering and design to build bespoke pages, so basically create a new page from scratch. But that was pretty time and resource intensive, right? Imagine every time you want to create a new page for a product, you have to sit down and think about, okay, what's the content model in Contentful? We have to have a designer kind of design from top to bottom. We have to build it from scratch. That would take a lot of time. It was something that we did occasionally, but obviously it was pretty resource intensive. The second option that we had is to build landing pages using Contentful. And the models that we had in Contentful historically really kind of fell into one of two buckets. Either they were extremely flexible, which meant that you could kind of create anything you wanted. You had dozens of different components that you could put on the page. You could have them all reference each other. You could even throw in like custom JSON or custom CSS to style them in customized ways. But that flexibility ultimately made it a pretty complex experience for Dan and for our marketing team to create landing pages, because it was very easy to create errors and it was pretty time consuming. Because there were so many individual little pieces that you could customize. And you could even get into tricky scenarios where two objects in Contentful were referencing each other. So you had this sort of like recursive loop, and it could just get into some really weird circumstances. Other models that we had in Contentful were useful, but they were very specific. So for example, if we wanted to create a webinar page or a contact form, the model was pretty straightforward, but you couldn't really add a lot of content to that page outside of just making it look like a webinar or a contact form, right? So in order to make everybody's lives better, we worked, so engineering, marketing, design, we all collaborated to build a system that was it really had two goals. First is that it was intuitive for our content creators to build quickly in Contentful, but also being flexible enough to really support all the different types of landing pages they might theoretically want to build, down the line. And so what we ended up building is what we internally call self-service landing pages. So self-service landing pages encompass two things. The first is the content model, which is how we model all the data on the page and all the data in each section on the page in Contentful. And the second is the component architecture. So that's how we, on the code side of things, take that data and build a page with it using Gatsby. So today we wanted to dive into both the content model and the component architecture and kind of walk through our implementations of both of those, talk about some of the challenges that we encountered creating both the content model and implementing it on the Gatsby side. And if we have at the end, we can build a page together using Contentful. So to get started, I think, Dan, do you want to talk about our content architecture and sort of how you thought about, what we want, like how we want to structure our content model?
Sure. So I had previous experience rebuilding a couple of B2B marketing websites with Contentful. I found it, like you said, there was kind of two extremes. Either it was really, I think, restrictive. Everything, the content was laid out in a lot of entry fields, or it was really flexible and kind of everything took forever to update. There were like very slow times for development, and you just kind of had to rebuild everything either in a custom way, or it's like, okay, now I'd like this, and then it would take a sprint cycle to build that out, or again, it was just like a simple entry form field. So our thinking was to kind of find a happy medium and start breaking down the web, and what many people have done is in blocks, where we have these kind of content blocks inside of section blocks that then reside inside a page. And those blocks you can use over and over again in different pages. You can use them in different orders. And there's a few different appearance settings that we'll see, some styles that you can set that really exponentiate the amount of combinations you can have on a page. So we can build these landing pages that seem to be different, be creative, yet still really display content and keep our brand at heart. You'll see that ours is pretty restrictive right now, but we'll go through ways that, like, if you weren't at a larger company and you wanted to be a little bit more flexible, you could definitely bring some of those things into Contentful. And I think that's the other thing with the content model is there's big trade-offs of what you bring inside the content model and what you make configurable in Contentful, and then what you leave to the engineering side and what you leave to almost like a constant. So I think those two things are big. Do we want to walk through kind of the components of the content model right now, Max, or are we going to come back to that?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, sweet. So let me share my screen quick. Hang on 1 minute. Sorry, I'm a little slow. All right. One share. All right, you should be able to see yourselves. Okay, so Contentful instance. Let's look at the content model. This is what we should be looking at, right? This content model now. Let's go to self-serve landing page. I don't have the content model graphics, Max. If you want to share those, it's probably better for you to share. Yeah, I was just going to say we probably don't want to look directly into this right now.
Okay, I can. Yeah. So do you see that?
Nope.
Now we need you to share your screen.
Ooh.
There we go. Boom.
Awesome. So yeah, this is a great model that Max made. It references, you can see the page at the top. The page is where we're going to add all of our basically meta info and page level info that is going to preside over the entire page, no matter what section's in it. So when you think about those things, it's going to be the URL slug, the meta title, the meta description, options, whether we want it indexed for Google or not, things like that, where it's going to persist on the entire URL. those things are going to sit at the page level, and that's it's content block. We call it self-service landing page, which you'll see as we go to build out something. But that is like the top of our hierarchy. The next part is a section. And a section you can think of as a thematic band of content. So a section, for instance, could be a hero. If you were on our homepage, well, I don't know what our homepage is exactly like right now, but let's say you wanted to make a 3-column piece of content that had 3 benefits. That would be, let's say, a grid. So we'd have a 3-section grid, and that would be a section, or a section like this with a banner where it's just a large piece of content. Those sections are going to take up blocks of visible space on your page, and they can go in different orders. And they can also have different sets of content inside them and different appearances. So content is the actual written content. So like a title, subtitle, description. That's handled in content. And then appearance handles what the section actually looks like. So things like a background color, font color, how much spacing there is between sections, all of that can be handled in the appearance content block. And then content itself could be shared in different sections. So let's say you want it to be a headline in one section and a different page, you want it to be a part of a grid. You can use that same content block in 2 different sections and without having to actually recreate that block. Same thing with appearances. If you like let's say, default appearance, you can apply that default appearance across multiple sections to keep your entire design nice and consistent.
Yeah, and the way that this ends up looking is, so this is an example of a self-service landing page that we built out using this model. So this, for example, is the full page, and so this is one section. This is what we call our 2-column hero section, right? So the section contains, as Dan said, both the content and the appearance objects, and the content object contains all the copy that we have here, as well as the calls to action, the images, all of that is contained within the content block. And then the appearance block essentially controls the color theming, which we'll talk about when we get into the technical implementation as well. But sort of the green color of the header, as well as the spacing between this section and the next section, that is controlled by the appearance block. So we'll dive deeper into that. Dan, maybe do you want to show what this looks like in Contentful? Example of a self-service landing page.
Yes, definitely. Let's take a look. All right, I can share my screen this time.
For like the Shopify one.
Yeah, sure. We can go over that Shopify one actually right now to see.
Yeah.
Comparison. All right, so here is that first level, what we talked about, page. So this is the page content model. It's the top of the hierarchy. We have page name. This is going to be just visible to Contentful. So it's not going to be the title of the page. It's just going to be the page itself inside Contentful. We do that to separate the actual dependency of these things. Previously, we've had where the page name also was conveniently the page title, but then like those things shouldn't be linked ever. One serves as like kind of a display here for Contentful kind of organizationally. And then obviously the page title is for SEO and for kind of the end user. So we didn't want to conflate those. So we took apart kind of the tie there. So we have page name, then a URL slug. So it's going to be /solutions/Shopify. It's kind of a lot of slashes. Meta title. Again, this is what shows up when you search on Google. Meta description pulls in automatically now from the top description there. SEO index. We're able now to index our content without asking the developer, hey, can you take this out or put it on robots text? We now have the ability to do that here. And then add social media, again, like the OG graphs, any of those social graph we'll pick up the image here that we add. And we can do that very simply. Let's look if we have something close. And sure. Again, something that would have taken us before kind of out of Contentful into the header, we now can do here. And then below that, we have content sections. So now we kind of have the shell of the page made. We now want to look at the content. We have we have like 7 sections here, and you can start looking at them in a side-by-side manner, I think, to show you. And actually, when we were going through and building this, we actually looked at a lot of other B2B websites and just in general, again, like landing page type websites. This is what the use was for. And we wanted to see if this model could build their websites as well. So we would go to some of the best designed websites, Stripe, Segment, and just look at their content layout and say, okay, could we think of this in a way that built sections? And we determined we could, and we figured out where everything would go. But you can see here, we have the hero. It's going to be this entire section of this subtitle, this title, this description, and these buttons. And so we'll look into this right now, this content section, and look one more level below. So naming is super important for us. Contentful and any kind of database type CMS like this can get really unruly very fast with people just adding in objects with no like nomenclature. We wanted to be pretty standard about that. So we have kind of the first level page, then we do this caret symbol with hero as the section title, and then the next one you'll see has content. So in that way, we're able to actually identify where things are, how deep they are in the tree, because unfortunately Contentful doesn't do that for us out of the box. So here we have our page title. Then a big one here is layout and what type of layout we're going to use. We have hero, we have 2-column hero. The hero, sorry, we'll go back to 2-column hero since that's what it is today. These are layouts will control the look and feel of the different content sections. So you go through, I'll show you a different one with a different layout, and we'll show how it looks completely different, but yet it has the same content. The content layer or the content section is right below here, and then the appearance section. So if you could think back to Max's tree, where we had the page, then a section, and then 2 kind of nodes off of that, one for content, one for appearance. This is where we'll start looking at that. The appearance first, it handles today a bottom margin, a background image, and a theme. A theme for us consists of the font color and the background. You can think about, you could change that up and be as prescriptive or as flexible as possible. So Max and I, one of the things that we spoke about when we were building this is like, what are the options we want in appearance? And for me as a marketer, I was like, oh, give me all the options. And then I know like working with our development team and design team, like obviously that's not always the best case. I might have a lot of faith in my own abilities, but just having people onboarding, being able to pick any color in the world to mix and match with any other color, you can see where like it would look ugly really quickly and kind of start to look non-professional. So we pick themes that encompass like a lot of those color choices and a lot of the spacing choices for us. Lastly, content. This is kind of like the secret sauce of the whole thing actually, is when you start to look at B2B websites and again, like landing pages and marketing pages, they tend to contain a lot of the same like tropes of layouts. So there tends to be a large title. There tends to maybe, if you want to be cool, a subtitle either right below that title or above it. It's usually like not even a subtitle, but more of a label. And then there's like a large piece of content that is the bulk of the description. Above or below that, there may or may not be like a link or a CTA. And you'll see that kind of persist throughout. Now there's like could be content and there cannot be content. So the absence of content doesn't necessarily mean that it's a new layout, but it does mean that it looks different. So you can see here continually like, okay, here's the title, here's the description, and here's an image connected to it. This one, here's an image, here's a title. We use them the same exact way. Here's a title, here's a subtitle, here's a description, here's an image. Those like same 4 things are repeated over and over. And whether it's on a responsive layout on this desktop or on mobile, it's going to be pretty consistently viewed. And this is like when me and Max sat down and we started to scope, this was like kind of the secret sauce is if we can make all the content entry appear similar to this, then the layouts and kind of the appearance can be controlled like on a separate plane, which really allowed for that flexibility.
Right. In other words, most parts of a given page, most different sections of the page, all have relatively similar content and content structure. And then we leave it to React to basically figure out how we're going to present and structure that content on the page, render that to the page. So we're getting the same content model every time, but each React component, whether it's the hero component, the showcase component, the items component, is going to just display that out and render it in a slightly different way.
So is now a good time to take a couple questions?
Sure. If you have some questions, we can definitely do that.
All right. Okay, our first question, maybe you've talked about this because it came early on and you hit it, but if there's anything you want to reinforce or reiterate, definitely curious to know how you model the self-service page section type. Can you guys see the question as it's written?
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually,
that probably helps.
I can show you maybe some different layouts. Like I think that would be the most helpful is the sections, the banding, get different layout types. And these things, quite honestly, we know we have to make the naming more semantic, but it helps us select like what it's going to look like. So we have like a 2-column hero. We have a feature grid. So a feature grid is going to be like this right here. So this is going to grid the content, and we just keep adding blocks of content. So if you see here, let's see if we can find one quick. Yeah, exactly. So here are multiple pieces of content, and they are going to create a grid here. Now you could use the same content in a banner section, let's say, and that would change the layout. This would become larger. Obviously, the title would shift to be more of like an H2, whatever size we're using for that in our design. And this would go to the size of the description text. So you can see like the content floats around, but right now sections are laid out in these layout types.
Yeah. And we'll show how all this is rendered on the React side in a little bit too.
And then just to answer that second question, because I think it's kind of similar in that you actually do want some content to be like very similar, but displayed in different sections and kind of in different ways. So it actually is really helpful as a marketer to be able to create like quick, like small resource snippets, or you can think like blog titles in different ways and render them in like different resource cards. That's one of the things we're working on now. And again, with like the way we go about, I guess the way we go about making the content in like that very structured way for us is consistent across the website. The other thing is the editor is really friendly in that you can just leave out content or use the rich content to kind of make it a little bit more flexible as well. So if we didn't have a description here, they wouldn't render and it would kind of collapse, and it would be like a much tighter grid system. So right there is like 2 different ways to do it, kind of built on one palette.
Yep.
All right, you want to have me stop sharing, Max, and then go over and show how it renders?
You can answer this question first.
We have
I'm
sorry. I was muted, so I apologize. We have a second question, if now's good. Do you ever run into issues with editor friendliness with this model? It seems like having
that was the one I just answered, my bad. You can totally read it out, Kirsten.
That's okay. Oh, you did? Oh, okay. I guess you did a little bit. Do you ever have a separate reference for appearances? could cause you to end up having a ton of entries, which usually leads to editor navigation confusion. I would imagine most content blocks on a site, even if used in multiple locations. All right. So do you feel like you answered this? Do you have any more you would like to say to this?
Yeah, I would say, though, obviously, it's not really, we can't solve as much as I think we'd like to it this way, but it is very cumbersome with Contentful, copying pages and nesting things. So I guess I would say editor's warning that linked entries and when nested entries, when you copy them, it doesn't create a perfect copy of every single node in that tree. It actually just copies the hub at that level, and all the nodes are still connected to their old respective spots. So it's definitely something to remember. One thing I do is I actually sometimes go backwards when I have to build a lot of content. I will build these small content sections first, and I'll keep duplicating the content that I know I need, and then I'll actually place them inside the page itself, whether that be like in a grid like this or a more like open set of 3. Let's see if we can find another one. Yeah, like this. So like I would have already made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Would have already made those blocks themselves, and then I'll go build the sections and I'll tie in the blocks. That's one way I kind of keep myself sane while using Contentful to make a lot of pages at once, because you can get kind of lost in the nesting.
Yeah, I think like one of the lessons learned, that we learned before this project that we tried to implement as much as possible with this content model is to keep it as flat as we can for the reasons that you said, because duplicating content in Contentful, if you have nested content, is a real pain because it only does a shallow copy. And so when we, we do have some hierarchy here with sections and content, but our previous models sometimes were layered, 3, 4, 5, references deep, and that can just be completely, or very difficult to make changes to.
Yeah, I've seen where like the title itself, the description, the button, they're all like one layer below and they're interchangeable. And like I would say that just like gets to a point where you have way too much functionality there, and like it's actually not going to be usable. Because one thing, each block, like it does take time. So when you're doing things in bulk, that's one thing with Contentful. You don't want to have every single option to make every single thing customizable, because it adds a ton of time on the development side, and not only engineering but like actual content creation.
Yeah.
All right, cool. All right. So I think we got that one, and we can move on.
Cool. So I wanted to, from here, kind of transition into how we implemented this on the technical side. So first, I wanted to give an overview of just like what the architecture looks like. So basically, how do we take the data that we're getting from Contentful and then turn that into a page in Gatsby? Then I was just going to walk through our actual code to kind of show in detail how that gets implemented. And then from there, we can kind of answer any questions and also talk about some of the challenges that we encountered while doing some of this implementation. So I'm going to share, let's see. So do you see this diagram?
We need you to screen share.
It's 2 button clicks, not 1.
Yeah, right. I know. There we go. now you're golden.
Yeah. So this is the overview of our technical architecture here, and I'll kind of walk through from left to right. So all the way on the left, you have the data that we're getting in Contentful. So this is just what we talked about. This this sort of hierarchical page, section, content, and appearance blocks. So basically at build time, what we do is first, after ingesting data from Contentful with the Gatsby source Contentful plugin, we have a template called self-service landing page. And so for each page, page in Contentful, basically we walk through this process. So first we query the data for a given page. We're going to get sort of a GraphQL, do a GraphQL query and get back a pretty large object that contains all the data for the page. And then for each section in the page, we're going to basically transform that into a component that we can render out. And the way that we do this, in this case, I'm sort of taking the example of the grid here, right? So we, for each section, we basically map that layout that we talked about, so in this case, grid, to a file that we have in our components. And that file has two things. It has both the React component, so in this case, grid, and it also has this function called map props. And the first thing that we do is we use the map props function that was in this component, and we pass the data that we get from Contentful into that map props function. And what that function does is it basically takes the Contentful data and flattens and basically normalizes what we get from Contentful into a props object. Then once we have that props object, we basically pass it straight in to the component that we got, that we sort of built. So our first step is we take the data from Contentful. Then we essentially normalize this data using a map props function that is custom for each component that we have, because we need to normalize that data in different ways depending on what that component is going to expect in terms of props. So we normalize that data, we pass it into the component. And we do that for each section. So at the end of this, we basically have an array of components rendered with the appropriate props. And we just render that as sort of a complete page. We build that as a complete page. And that's sort of the high-level overview of how this gets built. So let me check before I continue if there are any questions there.
We do have one. I will, about GraphQL. I wonder how you handle the GraphQL queries with deeply nested recursive content types.
Sure. So I'll show in a second what our GraphQL query looks like, but the short answer is that we fortunately don't allow recursive content types for this particular situation, just because it would get pretty tricky. Our nesting, and unfortunately our nesting is not too bad either. So yeah, the short answer is that we don't, because it would be a pain. Yeah.
Cool. We have another one.
Mm-hmm.
How do you render Markdown in long text field?
Yeah, so we have a component library, and one of the components that we have basically does that work for us. So we can pass in, we can basically pass in Markdown or sort of raw HTML into that component, and we sanitize it, but then we can just kind of render it out because we have a custom component that does this in our UI library.
Cool.
Yeah.
Those are all the questions we have at the moment.
Cool. So I'm going to go from that overview into kind of walking through what I just looked at, but how that actually looks in terms of the code. So again, these general steps. First, we query the data for a given page. Then we map it to the props. Then we render that component with the props passed in. And then we render the complete page with an array of rendered components. So this is what this looks like on the code side. So this is our self-service landing page template. So let's begin with sort of that first part. So here we have our query. So it's a pretty large query, but again, the advantage first, yeah, and I've seen larger queries, but the second is that part of the reason that we're able to keep this pretty reasonable is because we have this sort of reusable content model, which means that although we have, I think, 10 or 11 different components that you can add to a landing page, we have heroes, grids, content, forms, etc. We're just really making one query. Because all of those different components is just going to reuse, or is basically just going to use the same content structure, right? So this is that Contentful model, just kind of broken down into a GraphQL query. So we pull all this in into our landing page, and we hit this function prepare components, which basically does the bulk of the work. So in prepare components, basically we take that data, and then as I mentioned, for each section, this is all this mapping function is doing here, for each section that we got from Contentful, we are going to map the section.layout. So the section.layout refers to, again, the name of the component that we want to take. So it could be 2-column hero, it could be feature grid, it could be whatever. We map that name onto the actual component that we're going to be using, right? And so we map that, we kind of take the appearance, and I'll talk about how the styling works a little bit here in a second. But basically we map each section to the appropriate component. And then let's take a look at something like 2-column hero, because that's what we use in on the Shopify page. So I'll go into how we're using Loadable a little bit later. But basically what you can see here is that for each component, we have this map props method, which I mentioned before, that receives the data that we get from Contentful. We pass that in and this function normalizes the data that we get from Contentful and returns the props that we're going to pass into the function, or props that we're going to pass into the component. And we render that alongside the component itself. So the syntax here, if you haven't seen Loadable, might look a little bit new. But basically, if you're familiar with just like, kind of the basic React.create element, we're just saying, create this component, pass in these props. And the props that we're passing in take the data that we get from Contentful. This is what this props is. Takes the data that we get from Contentful, and it gets normalized using this map props function. We do that for all of our different components here. And so, yeah, again, so for each section, we find the appropriate component. That component gets it's sort of data mapped to props and passed in, and then we return it along with this color scheme. We wrap it in the color scheme provider that basically provides some of the theming options that I'll talk about in a second. And that's how we end up with our array of components. So if we return back to here, components is now an array of essentially rendered components. And all we need to do at that point on a given landing page is kind of just render it out into main, right? So all this other stuff is just, SEO and kind of general layout. But we just kind of take that array of components that we've prepared and render it out to the page. So that's kind of the general overview of what we do here. But I think it would be helpful to go a little bit deeper. So what actually happens in the map components or map props function? So remember, we go back here when we're rendering a given component, we pass in the props, and we get those props with this map 2-column hero props function. So let's take a quick look at the actual 2-column hero. So the component itself just is a typical React component. Nothing too remarkable about how we build this. This is really sort of where the most interesting work happens. So here is where we get data from Contentful. And this is where we begin to normalize it. So in the case of our hero, the props that we want to pass to it are a title, what we call the eyebrow, which is a little bit of text that appears above the title, the lead, which is sort of the longer bit of text, images, and calls to action. So we get all of that data from Contentful and basically just, pull out the entire section object, just the fields that we know that we need for a hero, flatten those out into a single object that then gets passed in as props into the object, and then that gets rendered out. And the important thing here is that each component has a different map props function. So in the case of a hero, you have these fields. In the case of something like feature grid, that's a little bit different. So in this case, you're still getting data from Contentful, but in this case, you want to map out and normalize that object a little bit differently. So in this case, we want a heading, a lead, and an array of items, and we sort of normalize that using this function here.
You ready for a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. We have this question here. Is there any particular reason why the template file is a JS file and not a TSX file?
Short answer is no, there's not a particular reason. We started building this using JavaScript. We could convert. We're just kind of slowly converting everything to TSX. So as we're building new components, we're building everything in TypeScript. But the file, our template was originally done in JS. It's kind of the short answer.
Real world question, real world answer.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Check that. All right, cool. So please do continue.
Yeah. So again, that was a quick overview of how this is implemented on the code side of things. So I just wanted to mention a couple of specific challenges to highlight as we were implementing this, because I think they're pretty interesting in terms of, particularly if you're working, some of this is specific to building landing pages, some of it is specific to Contentful, but I think all of these are kind of interesting things to be aware of. The first one is styling. So I mentioned that we have kind of an interesting approach to styling, which is that we use a custom theme provider. So we use Emotion as a framework, and so that allows us to do some custom theming here. And basically what this allows us to do is we can use context to wrap each individual component in its own color scheme provider, which essentially just defines a set of colors that are then accessible when we're doing our styling in the component. So what that means is, let's take a look at, so our color scheme provider is, again, just basically a theme wrapper. It's just providing a theme, and it passes in a color scheme that you can define in Contentful. The color schemes are actually defined here in this file. So you can see that each color scheme that we've defined has a variety of different colors, and how these colors get used just depends on the particular component. But in the case of the Shopify page, for example, we use the green theme, and so these are the colors that are available to that component when it gets built. And so if we take a look at some of our styling here, colors. You can see that the eyebrow, the heading, for example, they're all pulling colors from the color scheme object, which gets provided by our color scheme provider. As Dan mentioned, how we got to these particular colors, having a base, having cover, having gradients, was really a negotiation. Long story short, when we kind of did our original design, we really allowed creators to actually just enter any hex value they wanted. And this made our designers very nervous, as you could imagine, because they really wanted to make sure that we really stuck to a specific set of brand colors. And so we needed to really pin down a sort of finite set of colors that we could use that would work with, Gatsby's design, Gatsby's color theming. The advantage of this style of the system is that it's very easy to add new themes. And so, if Dan wants, a new kind of color set to be added, it's a pretty trivial amount of work just to figure out what those colors are going to be and get them added.
And not even my side too, like the design side, right? Let's say our designer wanted to pick a new color or wanted to rebrand. Like all of that is pretty much centrally controlled in this file, where like marketing, anyone on the content side doesn't have to go through, change out all the colors. It can pretty much be done from the central location.
Yeah. The second challenge that I wanted to throw out there was error handling. This is a particularly tricky one because of the content model that we have. So the advantage of our content model is that every component essentially just has a content block and an appearance block, and we know that it will have some of these fields. We know that it might have primary text, secondary text, images, etc. But not every component is going to use all of these fields. Didn't require, we didn't make any of these fields required, which means that they could be blank, they could be null, and we don't know that until build time. So as mentioned, as noted, we do use TypeScript for these files, but TypeScript really only helps you during development. It won't sort of suss out what's going to happen at build time. We don't know what data we're going to get. And so you'll notice that we have to do a lot of, we have to be pretty rigorous in terms of not assuming that any particular field is going to be available at build time. And so when we're doing, for example, our map props function, you can see we kind of fall back to an empty object in a lot of cases. And we also do a lot of, when we're actually rendering out in the component, we do a lot of ternary sort of checking, like, is this thing available? If it is, then render it out. And we have to do a lot of that work because we don't know at build time whether or not any given component is going to have all the fields that we might expect for it. So that's just a tricky thing. We have kind of the flexibility with this content model to make fields not required, but on the other end of that, you have to be really responsible about doing a lot of error handling and thinking through a lot of potential like null cases so that you don't accidentally break builds or get weird behavior. And then the final thing that I'll mention is that we did implement loadable components for self-service landing pages. And the reason that we do that is that essentially each, an individual page can be built of one or more of these different components. But without loadable components, we would be shipping the code. We'd basically be importing the code from all 10 or all 11 of our components into the page, even if it was only using, say, 3 or 4 of those components. So the advantage of doing something like code splitting using loadable is that we, for any individual page, will only include the components that are actually on the page. So this was a pretty important addition to self-service landing pages, just to make sure that we're not shipping larger bundles to the end user, not shipping more code that they need so that pages can load faster. So that's something that we've worked on for a while. There's some trickiness with implementing loadable components in a model like this. I won't have time to sort of go into them, but feel free to ask questions later. But yeah, I wanted to kind of note that code splitting and sort of dynamic imports using loadable components is kind of an important piece of this, from a performance standpoint.
Ready for a question?
Yep.
All right. Right. Okay. Do you mind talking through how you render or query the content, for example, within the Shopify benefits grid?
Yeah, let's see. So in this case, how we render query the content. Yeah. So what I can do is quickly show sort of how this looks on the Contentful side. And I'm just going to need to bring up another browser because that'll be helpful.
Sure.
To demo that. Okay. So, all right.
In the interest of time, that second question about code demo today, I'll just answer while you're pulling that up.
Go for it.
We will definitely, our hope is to get this into a state where we could put this as a starter for Gatsby, maybe like a B2B starter, and you'd be able to use our Contentful model that we have, and it would automatically be wired up. So I would say definitely on the shorter horizon, but we'll need a little bit of time. It will be open to the public.
Cool.
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, I can quickly show, kind of walk through the process of how the benefits grid gets rendered out. So this is the benefits piece. So what you see here is how it looks in Contentful. So this is our section, the feature grid section. A feature grid or a layout has both a single content field, but we also have this second field in a section called grid list item content. And so these are cases where you can essentially provide a list of content blocks that you want to provide for a given component. So not all of our components actually use this sort of array of content. Feature grid is one of them, though. So what we do is pretty much the same process here. So in sections, you'll see we have a items is the name of the field. Items basically just expects an array of these content blocks that have this shape. And then so in feature grid, when we're mapping the property out, we get the content and the items from our section block. And we just map that list of items to the particular, to the sort of standardized shape that we want to use here. So again, each item is actually just a content block. Again, going back here, these are just content blocks, just the way that everything else is a content block. It just happens to be an array of content blocks. And so we map that array of content blocks into an array of objects that look like this and pass that into, pass it in the feature grid, and then when we're rendering that out, we kind of just do that in the typical React way.
All right, excellent. Well, we have done the impossible, which is do this in exactly an hour. So yay for us. Why did I think it was going to be more complex, right? Isn't that always the way?
It's
very,
the
very
magic
quickly,
of the content block.
right? One question I have for you guys, which is just to wrap us up. What's next? Is this project done, or are there more things you're looking to do before we call this, like, before we start working on turning it into a starter for our users?
Max, you can go first.
Yeah. And do you want to? Okay.
All right. I was gonna say, I can go forever.
We have a couple of different things. First on the list, so I talked about Loadable and using Loadable Components. There are some performance improvements that we can continue to make there. As I said, there's some gotchas and some difficult things, especially when you have a site like Gatsby.com, where some of the pages are use Loadable Components and some of them don't. And so we're still accounting for all the error cases there. So some of what we're doing right now is just improving performance with Loadable Components. The second thing that we're working on is providing more themes, so more color themes. We're thinking about creating specifically inverted themes. And the third thing is basically building a way to use this system to create sort of a list of blog posts model. So right now, as you can see, each landing page is sort of a flat page, right? You kind of have each component, and you can link to other parts of the site. But what we would like to be able to do is within this content model, be able to define, like, here are a list of other pages, and you can sort of roll all of those pages up into, kind of a single kind of landing page, so you can see like a list of blog posts. And so that content editors don't have to necessarily go in and add into Contentful and add new blog posts each and every time a new blog post is created. So some sort of way to sort of, in an automated way, wrap up content into like a list.
Nice. Yeah, I'm sure that'll have a lot of use. So a good one to add.
Yeah.
Anything to add to that, Dan?
Anything else I didn't cover, Dan?
I don't think so. I think those two definitely are the major ones for me. I think as we go forward, we're just moving everything into this section, like page by page, just like any other process. And we're coming across new pages that previously we have to build a new layout for, where it's like, okay, well, this isn't in the bounds that we've constructed right now. Max, what kind of new layout do you think we could use? And we're not really in the business right now of building like a custom layout for each single thing, but like we'd love to find a balance between customizable but also reusable. So is this like is this going to be a true one-off? Because if it is, it's probably going to go to the back of the backlog, but can we stretch it into a way where, we could use this for another part of the website where they also need this content kind of laid out in this way, where it's like content, or a list or some sort. I think we've been really good about reusing stuff. So continuing to go about that and build out new little reusable layouts is huge.
Cool. And that's good practice anyway, probably, for consistency across the site. Yeah. Right. Well, this was fabulous. Thank you so much, guys. And thank you for everybody who joined us today for this. And I think, as you can tell, there may be a second installment of this content when we get more done, and maybe around the time we're ready to make this a shareable starter. So thanks a bunch. If you have any questions, please do follow up with us on Twitter, or we also have a Discord. So any place where you find us, just send us questions. We'll make sure we get them answered. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Great
Kirsten.
questions today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.